The psychology of people who talk to themselves. What your inner voice really means. Have you ever caught yourself mid-sentence, speaking out loud when absolutely no one else was in the room? Not shouting in frustration, not losing your grip on reality, just speaking, quietly, almost tenderly, a whispered thought while brushing your teeth, a half-finished sentence directed at your own reflection, a question asked to the empty air around you. The kind of moment you instinctively hide from others because you're not entirely sure why it happens or what it means about you. You're simply there, going through the ordinary motions of your day, and suddenly there's another presence. A voice that speaks, a voice that listens, an entire conversation happening just beneath the surface of your visible life. You might laugh it off when you catch yourself doing it. Or you might freeze for a moment, suddenly hyper-aware of yourself, because you know exactly how society treats this behavior. The world is remarkably quick to call you strange for it, quick to label it as loneliness, instability, or evidence that something inside you has fundamentally gone wrong. So you tuck these moments away like shameful secrets, like things that shouldn't happen to normal, well-adjusted people. But somewhere deeper, you know the truth. It didn't happen by accident. There's a reason the words slip out when your psychological guard drops, when you're overwhelmed and your heart feels heavy, and you sense that no one in your life really sees the full truth of who you are. The voice you speak to isn't imaginary. It's not delusion or the beginning of some mental unraveling. It's the part of you that has lived through every single moment of your existence, but rarely gets permission to speak freely. The child who learned early to stay quiet and not cause problems. The teenager who swallowed their feelings because they were told those emotions were too much, too intense, too inconvenient. The adult who learned to perform strength, efficiency, and composure even while internal storms raged in complete silence. Talking to yourself is not madness. It's your mind attempting to reunite with itself, to find coherence and wholeness. It's your internal world desperately trying to find alignment because somewhere along the way, through years of conditioning and adaptation, your authentic inner voice was pushed underground, silenced, made to feel unwelcome. And now it returns in fragments, in whispers, in those rare moments when no one else is around to interrupt or judge. Think carefully about those times when you mentally argue with someone hours after a conversation ended. When you rehearse what you'll say before walking into an important room. When you soothe yourself during moments of fear or crushing self-doubt. When you repeat the same reassuring phrase over and over until your breathing finally steadies. These aren't accidents or quirks. These are sophisticated survival strategies your psyche developed over years. Your self-talk has been your witness, your confidant, your invisible guardian, especially during moments when the external world felt too sharp and hostile to face directly without some form of internal support. And if you listen closely, really pay attention, you'll notice something profound and unsettling. The voice you speak to isn't a stranger at all. It's you. The you that remains when all the performance ends. The you that has been patiently waiting to be acknowledged, understood, and finally heard. To understand why this inner dialogue feels simultaneously so natural and yet so intensely private, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to where your inner voice first learned to speak. Back to childhood, where all of this began. Where the inner voice was born. Have you ever watched a young child playing completely alone? Not just playing, but actively narrating their entire experience. Voicing every movement, every feeling, every detail of their small imagined world. A toy car placed carefully on a table becomes a character with purpose and personality. A whispered conversation unfolds between action figures only the child can see and understand. There's a gentle, instinctive rhythm to it, a natural dialogue with the self that needs no outside validation. You once did this too, before you learned that silence was safer, before you learned to hide your inner world from others. A child speaks out loud because their developing mind is still learning how to hold itself together, how to make sense of overwhelming feelings and confusing experiences. Developmental psychology, particularly the work of Russian psychologist Lev Vygotsky, tells us that children naturally externalize thought before they develop the capacity to fully internalize complex emotions. Their voice becomes a bridge, a crucial tool for translating chaotic feelings into something they can begin to understand and manage. When the world feels too big, too loud, too uncertain and unpredictable, the spoken word becomes a tiny anchor in the emotional storm. Simple phrases like "it's okay," "we're fine," or "this goes here" aren't just words. They're the external voice actively training the internal voice, building the psychological infrastructure that will last a lifetime. But not every child receives consistent comfort and emotional attunement from the adults around them. Some children grow up with parents who are physically present but emotionally distant, faces that look at them but never truly see them, never truly understand what they're feeling. Some grow up in homes where love feels unpredictable and conditional, where affection depends entirely on performance and good behavior, where the child learns early that authentic feelings need to be carefully hidden to avoid upsetting the fragile emotional ecosystem of the family. And some children are forced to mature far too quickly, learning to understand, regulate, and navigate complex emotions completely alone, while their peers are still allowed the luxury of simply feeling without analysis. So the child begins speaking to themselves not just playfully, but as a quiet, desperate form of emotional survival. The voice becomes protector, companion, and witness all at once. When no one asked how their day was, the voice did. When disappointment cracked something small but significant inside their chest, the voice stitched it carefully back together. When fear crept in during the long, dark nights, the voice whispered reassurance into the surrounding darkness. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the developing self became both caregiver and child, both the one who needs and the one who provides. This is how your inner voice was actually born. Not as something strange or pathological, but as something deeply, essentially human. It emerged as the result of a mind that absolutely refused to collapse under pressure, a heart that refused to stay silent and invisible, a soul that would not allow itself to disappear completely, even when the external world seemed to demand exactly that. And over time, as the child grows older, the toys fade away and the imaginary worlds gradually dissolve. Yet the voice remains, persistent and necessary. No longer spoken with childhood innocence, but now layered with accumulated memory, unspoken longing, and all the words that were never safely said out loud to anyone else. Childhood ends, but the fundamental need for comfort, understanding, and emotional connection does not. And so the voice evolves, adapts, survives, becoming quieter, more carefully hidden, more shadowed. A secret conversation carried into adulthood, waiting patiently for the moment it will finally be heard and acknowledged again. The hidden conversations we carry into adulthood, there comes a moment in life, usually sometime in your 20s or 30s, when you realize you've become extraordinarily skilled at appearing composed and put together. You know exactly how to speak in the socially appropriate tone. You know when to nod, when to smile, how to hold your facial expression perfectly steady even when something inside you twists painfully. You know how to appear completely fine, functional, normal. But the voice inside you, that voice that once spoke so freely during childhood, didn't disappear. It simply learned to hide behind the carefully constructed mask you wear for the outside world. You notice it most acutely in quiet, unguarded moments. Standing in the bathroom, staring into the mirror longer than functionally necessary. Or in the kitchen late at night when the day has already completely exhausted you and the silence feels heavier than the surrounding darkness. You speak softly, almost inaudibly, privately rehearsing what you wish you had said earlier in that difficult conversation. or planning what you hope to say tomorrow, trying desperately to find the courage that didn't exist in the actual moment when you needed it most. The voice emerges not because you're weak or strange or broken. It comes out because something inside you is actively trying to keep you from completely collapsing under the accumulated weight of your own expectations and the world's demands. Psychologists refer to this phenomenon as internal dialogue or self-directed speech. But there's something more complex and layered happening beneath that clinical terminology. It's not just one unified voice. It's actually many voices, different psychological parts speaking at different times. There's the narrator, the observing voice that describes what you're doing as though giving shape and meaning to your own existence. There's what Carl Jung would call the shadow voice, the one that holds your carefully suppressed disappointments, your unspoken anger, your unresolved grief. And then there's what psychologists call the internalized parent, the voice that tries to soothe you when life feels unbearably heavy, or alternatively scolds you when you believe you should have performed better. These voices aren't separate personalities or signs of dissociation. They're fragments of you, different aspects of your psyche that had to separate just to help you survive difficult circumstances. And so you talk to yourself when decisions feel overwhelming and paralyzing. You whisper, "It's okay," when no one else is physically present to say those words for you. You ask yourself questions out loud because somehow answers feel more real, more trustworthy when they're spoken rather than just thought. You argue with yourself because sometimes you are literally the only person who understands the full complexity of what you're feeling and experiencing. The external world sees a competent adult performing normal life, but inside, you're still negotiating with the child who once learned to hold everything alone, still trying to integrate all the different parts of yourself that survival forced you to split apart. There is loneliness embedded in this pattern, yes. That's undeniable. But there's also profound resilience. The voice inside you is living proof that you never completely abandoned yourself, even during times when others did, even when you felt utterly alone. The mask you wear for the world may be polished, calm, and apparently well adjusted, but the voice behind it is raw and real and honest, continuously trying to pull the scattered pieces of who you are back into some form of coherent alignment. The neuroscience of self talk to truly understand why this inner dialogue persists, why it feels so necessary and instinctive and deeply emotional. We need to step into the realm of psychology and neuroscience. We need to understand what's actually happening in your brain when you speak to yourself. Have you ever wondered why thoughts feel so much heavier when they stay trapped inside your head? Why a problem, when kept entirely internal, seems impossibly tangled and dense, but the moment you speak it aloud, even to an empty room, something begins to loosen and clarify. This isn't coincidental or imaginary. The human mind isn't only a place of abstract thought. It's also a place of echo, reflection, and sound. Your voice is a powerful psychological tool, and speaking to yourself is one of the oldest, most fundamental ways the human brain organizes overwhelming reality. Lev Vygotsky, the pioneering Russian psychologist, developed what he called the theory of private speech. He carefully observed that children first speak aloud to guide themselves through the world, to remind themselves, to self-soothe, to make sense of confusion. Over time, society systematically teaches the child to silence this external voice, to internalize it completely. But the underlying mechanism never disappears. The voice never truly goes away. It simply retreats inward beneath the surface, where it becomes the hidden foundation of what neuroscientists call metacognition, literally thinking about your own thinking. Talking to yourself is your mind's attempt to bridge the persistent gap between raw emotion and rational interpretation. When you speak aloud, your left brain, the analytical and structured hemisphere, and your right brain, the emotional and intuitive hemisphere, begin to communicate more clearly and effectively with each other. The voice isn't a sign of psychological instability. It's actually your nervous system actively reaching for balance and integration, like two hands finally meeting and clasping in the dark. Research by psychologists Gary Lupien and Daniel Swingley has demonstrated that self-talk significantly improves emotional regulation. The act of saying something out loud measurably slows your nervous system, lowers cortisol levels, and helps your prefrontal cortex, the seat of rational thought, regain control from your amygdala, the primitive part of your brain that reacts purely out of fear and instinct. This is precisely why, in moments of crisis or overwhelming emotion, you instinctively whisper, "It's okay," to yourself. Even if you don't fully believe those words in that moment, your body and nervous system respond positively to the sound of your own reassurance. Self-talk also significantly strengthens memory and learning. When you speak something out loud, you anchor it more deeply in your neural networks. Your voice becomes a psychological marker, a place of return, like carving a small, permanent symbol into the wood of your life so you can find your way back when everything feels disorienting and overwhelming. But underneath all of this scientific understanding is something more intimate and fragile. The voice you speak to is also the voice you've systematically hidden from the world. It represents the parts of you that were silenced by external expectations, by disappointment, by fear of judgment or rejection. The inner dialogue reveals the psychological fractures, the pieces of yourself that learned how to survive without being fully seen or understood by others. So when you speak to yourself, you're not just thinking or processing. You're actively remembering, reassembling, negotiating with the scattered pieces of your own existence. And when your internal world is divided, when something deep inside you remains unresolved, unspoken, or quietly aching, the voice you speak aloud begins to reveal exactly what you're most afraid to consciously feel. When the voice becomes a mirror, have you ever noticed how the voice you speak to, when no one is around, seems to know things you never say out loud to anyone else? It knows the disappointments you dismissed and minimized, the apologies you never received but desperately needed, the grief you never allowed yourself to feel fully because you had to keep functioning. That voice isn't just a mental habit. It's a witness, the only witness who has seen every version of you that the outside world never did. There are nights when you find yourself speaking softly into the quiet darkness as if someone were sitting invisibly beside you, not loudly or dramatically, just quiet, tired confessions. Words like "I'm trying," or "I don't know what else to do," or even the weighted silence between sentences, the kind that holds more truth than any language could possibly translate. In those vulnerable moments, you're not talking to empty air. You're speaking directly to the part of yourself that has carried every hurt without complaint, every disappointment without acknowledgement. Psychologists who study emotional processing tell us that unresolved emotions don't simply disappear when we ignore them. They sink deeper. They settle into the body. They wait patiently in the shadows. Shame becomes a shadow that follows quietly behind you everywhere you go. Loneliness becomes a subtle but persistent ache in your ribs. Grief becomes a room in the house of your mind that you never fully enter, never fully explore. And when these powerful feelings have nowhere external to go, when there's no one who feels safe enough to hear them, they instinctively look for the only presence that has always remained constant and available: you. So the inner voice becomes a confessor, a patient listener, a kind of invisible companion you return to again and again, because no one else in your life has ever stayed as consistently present. Sometimes it soothes you with gentleness. Sometimes it unintentionally hurts you with harsh self-criticism. Sometimes it reminds you of everything you've desperately tried to forget. It becomes a mirror you didn't consciously ask for, one that reflects not who you pretend to be for others, but who you actually are when all the performance finally ends. And yes, there is genuine pain embedded in that reflection. Because speaking to yourself in this way can mean finally admitting that there have been significant parts of your life where you were alone when you absolutely shouldn't have been. Moments when you desperately needed someone to say, "I see you, I understand you, you're not crazy for feeling this way." And no one did. The validation never came. So the voice in your chest, that persistent inner companion, took the place of love that was never offered, comfort that was never provided, presence that never arrived when you needed it most. It became your replacement for intimacy, for connection, for being truly known. Talking to yourself is not strange or pathological, but it is intensely private because it carries the full weight of everything you've held in silence for years or decades. And the world, with its surface-level understanding, doesn't know how to hold the kind of raw honesty that exists in those moments. Society hears self-talk and immediately thinks of instability or loneliness. It doesn't see the endurance required. It doesn't recognize the courage. It doesn't acknowledge the child who learned to survive emotionally alone. But society rarely sees truth with compassion or nuance. And it's here, in this misunderstanding, in the vast space between stigma and reality, that we need to confront how culture shapes our relationship with our own inner voice. Why society fears the quiet mind. Have you noticed how uncomfortable the modern world becomes when someone is simply, peacefully with themselves? How silence is treated like a problem that urgently needs to be fixed. How solitude is automatically mistaken for sadness or social dysfunction. We live in a society that fundamentally fears the quiet mind. A culture that praises constant loudness, visibility, and performance. The endless display of self for others to observe, judge, and approve. In such a world, speaking to yourself is seen not as healthy intimacy with your inner life, but as something to be corrected, laughed at, or carefully hidden from view. From a very young age, you were taught that thinking should stay inside your head and feelings should be managed discreetly and privately. You learned to keep your voice internal, your questions unspoken, your doubts smoothed over with socially acceptable smiles and reassuring nods. People don't actually fear your words. They fear the honesty behind them. Because talking to yourself is raw and unfiltered. It reveals an inner world that cannot be curated or edited for public consumption. And we live in an era where identity itself has become performance, where personal value is measured by how well you fit into the collective expectations of the crowd. Society calls self-talk strange or concerning because it reminds people of their own unspoken thoughts, the ones they spend their entire lives desperately trying not to confront or acknowledge. So they label you to create distance from their own discomfort. They call you lonely, as if meaningful companionship should always come from external sources. They call you unstable, as if sanity is measured purely by silence. They call you weak, as if speaking to yourself is anything but an act of psychological endurance. And yet, throughout human history, some of the greatest minds regularly spoke to themselves. Philosophers walking alone under ancient skies, speaking their profound questions into the night. Poets whispering lines under their breath until meaning emerged. Scientists, artists, monks, warriors, people who understood that the deepest transformation happens in honest conversation with the self. The inward voice has always been sacred in contemplative traditions. It's only modern consumer culture that has tried to turn it into something embarrassing. Because modern culture worships distraction, noise, and constant external engagement. It tells you that if you're not speaking to others, posting yourself, proving yourself, displaying yourself for validation, then you don't meaningfully exist. It tells you to replace introspection with consumption, emotion with entertainment, presence with performance. And in doing so, it systematically disconnects you from the only relationship that lasts your entire life, the relationship with yourself. So you learn to hide the voice, to speak only when absolutely no one is around, to pretend you don't need to hear yourself. But there is a profound cost to living with a voice that no one else hears. a slow erosion of the part of you that remembers who you truly are beneath the image, beneath the performance, beneath all the world's expectations. And that cost reveals itself in the quietest, most hidden place of all. The emotional toll of carrying your voice alone. Have you ever felt like your own mind has become simultaneously your refuge and your prison? Like the only place you can speak with complete honesty is inside yourself. Yet that very same place is also where your deepest doubts echo the loudest. The inner voice that once protected you can become the psychological battlefield where your unresolved past and overwhelming present violently collide. There are moments when the voice is gentle and nurturing, when it holds you the way no one else ever did, when it reminds you to breathe deeply, to soften your tense shoulders, to try again tomorrow. In these moments, the voice is a sanctuary, a quiet room inside your chest where the harsh world cannot reach you. It becomes living proof that you have never truly abandoned yourself, even when others did. But there are nights when that same voice turns sharp and cruel. When it becomes the echo of every disappointment, every unspoken fear, every painful memory you hoped time would eventually erase. It tells you you're not enough. It replays every mistake like a film loop that refuses to fade. It calls your name in a tone you learned from someone who once made you feel small and worthless. The inner voice becomes your shadow, the version of you built entirely out of every wound you've carried in silence. Over time, this dynamic shapes you not just emotionally, but relationally. When you learn to lean entirely on your own voice for comfort and understanding, other people can begin to feel unnecessary or, worse, psychologically unsafe. You may hesitate to explain yourself to others because the voice already understands perfectly. You may withdraw from relationships because the voice is easier and safer to speak to. You may find yourself living behind walls made entirely of your own thoughts, walls that even you sometimes struggle to climb out of. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, tells us that healthy intimacy is learned through being seen and emotionally soothed by another person. But if you rarely receive that kind of attuned care, if the world systematically taught you to rely only on yourself, then your inner voice becomes the substitute for love, a memory of the connection you always wished for, a companion shaped from the absence of others. And in that sense, the voice is both miracle and wound, proof of survival and evidence of what you had to survive. This pattern can profoundly affect your identity. You begin to question who you are outside the realm of your inner world. Your self-worth can become dangerously tangled in whether the voice approves or criticizes you. You may fear vulnerability because letting someone else truly in means risking the one stability you've always known, that private conversation within. And yet this story doesn't have to end in isolation or tragedy. Because the same voice that once carried your loneliness, that witnessed your pain, can also guide you back to yourself. If you learn not just to hear it, but to understand it. If you listen differently, with compassion instead of fear, the voice can stop being a battleground and become a bridge instead. A bridge to genuine healing. Turning the voice into a relationship, have you noticed that the voice inside you changes depending on how you speak to it? The same inner companion that once reassured you can become harsh when you approach it with impatience or judgment. And the same voice that once frightened you can soften remarkably if approached with gentleness. The goal has never been to silence this voice. It has always been to understand it, to transform it from an automatic reaction into a conscious relationship. Healing begins the moment you stop treating the voice as a problem to be fixed and start treating it as a message to be understood. The next time you hear yourself whisper something in the quiet, pause. Listen. Not with judgment or panic, but with genuine curiosity. Ask yourself, who is speaking right now? The child who once felt alone, the adult who is exhausted from carrying everything, the heart that wants to be held but has never been shown how. The voice is not random. It's memory shaped into language. Psychologists refer to this process as inner reparenting, learning to give yourself the emotional presence and attunement you needed when you were younger but didn't receive. When you say, "it's okay" to yourself, you're stepping into the role of the parent you wished you had. When you speak to yourself with patience instead of frustration, you're actively repairing the fractured bond between your past and present self. You're becoming the one who stays. You can begin to consciously guide the voice instead of just reacting to it. When fear rises and the voice trembles, speak softly, "I hear you." When doubt sharpens into self-criticism, respond with steadiness, "I am trying and that matters." When loneliness echoes through your thoughts, remind yourself, "I am here with you. You are not alone." This is not delusion. This is self-compassion, the emotional oxygen mask every human being needs but few are actually taught how to use. Journaling can help give the voice tangible shape and structure. Writing allows the intangible to become visible. When you place your chaotic thoughts on a page, the overwhelming chaos becomes a landscape you can actually navigate. You no longer drown in the feeling. You can walk through it, map it, understand where it comes from and where it might lead. The page becomes a mirror that does not judge. And slowly, something fundamental shifts. The voice becomes less of a battleground and more of a dialogue. You stop running from yourself. You stop fearing your own inner world. The voice that once felt like a burden becomes a companion. Not perfect, not always calm, but honest. And honesty is where all genuine healing begins. Because the voice inside you has never been your enemy. It has always been the part of you that refused to disappear, even when life tried to silence it. You're not talking to yourself. You're returning to yourself. Have you ever realized that the voice inside you is older than your conscious memories? It has lived through every silence you endured, every moment you swallowed your true feelings to keep the peace, every time you walked away when you wanted to stay, or stayed when you desperately needed to leave. It is the voice that never left you, even when others did. This voice has witnessed the quiet heartbreaks, the ones that left no visible bruise but changed you forever. It remembers the first moment you felt deeply misunderstood, the first time you pretended not to care when you cared desperately, the first night you cried quietly so no one would hear, the first time you realized that the world does not always offer gentleness, even to those who give it freely. And through all of it, it stayed. It spoke. It kept you company in the places no one else could enter. The voice inside you is not a flaw or a sign of weakness. It is a testament, a living archive, a memory woven into sound and breath. When you speak to yourself today, you are not merely thinking or processing. You are tending to the child you once were, the teenager who felt too much, the adult who learned to carry themselves through storms without help. You are acknowledging the parts of you that survived without applause, without witness, without reassurance from anyone else. You are giving language to the experiences that shaped you in silence. And yes, sometimes the voice trembles. Sometimes it carries anger. Sometimes it echoes regret. But even that is a form of love, because pain only speaks when it wants to be healed, when it's ready to be seen. Your inner voice is not trying to control you. It is trying to reach you. It wants you to notice the places where you are still hurting. It wants you to recognize the strength you built entirely on your own. It wants you to understand that you never truly walked alone, even in the loneliest moments. So the next time you find yourself whispering in an empty room, do not rush to silence it. Do not call yourself strange or broken. Do not feel ashamed. Listen. Really listen. You are hearing the truth of your own existence. If you speak to yourself, it is because part of you is still trying to be heard, because part of you is still healing, because part of you still remembers what it felt like to be unseen and refuses to let that be the end of the story. There is nothing crazy about that. In fact, it is profoundly, essentially human. You have been your own witness, your own comfort, your own home, and now you understand why. You are not talking to yourself. You are returning to yourself.